People ask me why I use a pen name. It's because nobody can pronounce or spell Treva Rodemaker. When I turned in my little biography, I said that I was blogging about pirates. Now I have achieved another thing about pirates. I have got two publications out on Kindle. The first one is Scarlet Sails. The second one is Gentleman and Fortune. It's the saga of the pirate empire, and I hope that you all take a minute to go look that up when you get out of here tonight. This is the piece which won the Robin Harrington Memorial Short Story Contest. It is set in the same world as my pirates, and it is titled The Sea Ghost Pine. "That's it, boys," the boatswain shouted, his voice straining through the gale. "Get below, batten down." Thaddeus bowed against the screaming wind. His hands felt like lumps of ice, and his arms ached with exhaustion from hauling rope. 3 weeks ago, running off to become a sailor had seemed like a romantic solution to the heartlessness of his landlady's daughter. Now he only hoped he would survive the voyage. He staggered forward, gripping the ratlines, lunging to grab the capstan before the ship's violent pitching threw him to the sharks, finally sliding onto his knees to grip the hatch's edge. He struggled to lift the cover, but his numb hands refused to grip the rain-slick wood. Then a warm, bulky figure crouched down beside him. It was Darby. Thaddeus drew a grateful breath. Darby seemed to know everything about ships. He wouldn't be stopped by a heavy hatch cover. They crouched together for a moment, clutching the wood with white-tipped fingers as another wave washed over. Then the deck heaved upward. Darby threw back the hatch and slid down the companionway. Thad stumbled along behind, feet skidding on the wet rungs. The boatswain shoved Thad impatiently, knocking him into a miserable heap on the deck below. Then the hatch cover thumped shut, leaving the below decks in near total darkness. Thad scrambled out of the boatswain's path, coughing and dripping, and wiped his glasses on the arm of his streaming shirt. What an idiot he'd been to imagine a sea voyage would heal his broken heart. Maria had been right. He was a romantic fool. Now he was stuck in this horrible place. How miserable was it possible for a man to be without dying from sheer despair? He stumbled toward the crew's quarters, dripping and shivering. He had left school for this. So much for first-hand observation of natural philosophy. A few figures crouched near a dim lantern. Swaying hammocks cast eerie shadows on the bulkheads. Many of the crew were taking what rest they could, but it would take a lot of rum to actually put a man to sleep on a night like this. Thad joined the group and held his freezing fingers out to the lamp's flame. Someone handed over a mug of tea, not quite cold. His teeth chattered against the rim, but he drank gratefully. Darby sat down next to him with a groan, cold enough to freeze off a brass monkey. The heaving ship rose on the next wave until it felt like she was standing on a rudder, paused for a breathless heartbeat, then plunged down the opposite side. Wooden beams groaned like the damned. Then, with a shudder, she started up again. "Do you think she'll hold?" asked one of the cabin boys, eyes gleaming in the darkness. "Now, don't you worry," Darby answered. "The Jane Dowling's a sturdy old gal. She'll keep us safe." "Captain's got too much canvas on the mainmast," grumbled an elderly sailor. "The whole thing's bound to carry away, or my name's not Donald." "Your name ain't nothing," Darby rejoined. "That mainmast's more solid than the rock itself. Don't go scaring these young'uns." "My name's Donald Elijah McGee, you lubber," the old seaman growled. "I've been a sailor 40 years, and I can tell you there ain't a mast on the sea that can take the strain that sail's bearing. Might as well say your prayers. We won't live out the night." Thad felt fear rising through his exhaustion. He had studied the classics, but had not yet learned much about the sailing of ships. He squinted hopefully at Darby. "I'm telling you," Darby replied, "there's not a mast in the world like Jane Dowling's mainmast and spars. It's made out of one white pine, all 30 feet of it, and it'll bear what comes." "You don't make spars out of pine." "Well, Jane's builders did, and a good job of it, too." With a groan and a lurch, the ship headed up the next wave. "Picked the right tree, that's for sure. That mast will never break. It's haunted, it is." Thad's teeth had stopped chattering with the warm tea, but now they started again. "Haunted? The ship's haunted?" Darby gave a wry grin. "Not the whole ship, boy. Just that one mast. It's a friendly spirit. It keeps the mast safe, see?" Another sailor broke in. "I've seen it! A mist, sort of, on a cloudless night. clinging around the mast and singing. Men nodded. A sad song. Someone else added, I've seen her. It's a woman. I'd come upon it one fine spring night years ago. Seen her sort of hanging in the air, her long hair flying around her, stroking the mast and singing in some foreign tongue. I seen her last voyage, though I wouldn't call her young. You can see right through her, someone else joined in. She must have come from far ashore. You can see leaves in her hair and vines wrapped around her legs. At the mention of a woman's legs, the men went silent for a moment. Finally, Thad spoke. If this thing is actually a restless spirit, then why is it haunting our mast? Spirits linger where they've experienced trauma in life. What's that to do with us? We've spoke on it, Darby replied. We figure it were over a lost love. She must have hung herself when that mast was a tree. Not likely, thought Thad, remembering Maria. I'm sure no woman has ever hanged herself for love. They're faithless creatures. Footsteps pounded and the boatswain's voice bellowed into the cabin. Mayhew, Roberts, your turn on the pump. Step lively. Two of the figures in the hammocks came to life and lurched out. Thad listened as the thumping of the pumps paused, then resumed with more vigor. Even if the mast didn't crack, if the hull didn't give way, how could they go on like this? Wet and cold and no fire in the cook stove. How he longed for the breakfasts his landlady had served at the university. The scones were rock hard and the coffee tasted like mud, but it had been hot. Someone tried to start a cheery song, but voices petered out on the first chorus. Thad found a way to brace himself so he was almost comfortable. His body ached to crawl off to his hammock, but the story of the ghost kept circling in his mind. Why would a suicide haunt the dead hulk of the tree where she had died? It made no sense. His eyes closed, and he imagined himself in a sunlit glade, listening to a lecture on the afterlife. Then a troop of nymphs appeared from the forest, leading the students to dance. Thad watched one of the nymphs lead a student to a shady tree, luring him with the offer of a kiss. At the last minute, she laughed and melted into the rough bark, leaving the young man staring foolishly. Then lightning cracked. The earth began to shake. Thad started awake. The Jane Darling was moving in some way that even his landsman's senses knew were wrong, and the boatswain was screaming orders. Confused, Thad tottered to his feet and stumbled toward the companionway. At the hatch, a flood of salt water smacked him in the face. Nonetheless, he struggled up onto the deck. Dawn showed an unearthly light up under the black roiling clouds, and the yellow rays gilded the ship with light. The deck pitched and rolled more violently than ever, and a horrible noise came from above. The mainsail flapped loose, but Thad hardly looked at the mess. His eyes leaped to the spectral figure floating next to the mainmast. He had envisioned a beautiful young girl, but the apparition before him more resembled a skeleton. Emaciated gray, crowned with dead leaves, it clutched the mainmast and howled more horribly than the wind. The Grecian robe wrapped around it seemed tattered and dirty. It shrieked at Thad, eyes full of hate, then turned back with an anguish cry to embrace the cracked mast. Thad barely noticed the seaman scrambling onto the deck behind him. His heart pounded and his eyes caressed the hag. A dryad. She had to be. The spirit of the long-dead tree, following her beloved pine even after death. Far from home, severed from the forest, but never parted from the magnificent tree she loved. How she had withered, and with the withering of her magic, so the power of the mast must have faded until the men relying on it were betrayed and the mast cracked. A fresh gust of wind made the great mast twist. The ratlines stretched so taut they vibrated. The fore staylines snapped. A dozen men struggled across the pitching deck, bearing a great log to prop up the mast. Darby scrambled up the remaining ratlines, rope in hand, apparently determined to replace the whipping forestay. Sail flapping, the Jane Darling turned away from the wind, and the next wave broke over her side. Thad felt the deck shudder. All around him, men worked to repair the damage, while he stood staring at the shrieking dryad, which no one else seemed to notice. She was their only hope. Thad felt his heart lurch. She must hate the humans who had killed her tree, but they needed her. Somehow he must persuade her to hold the mast together. Thad fought his way forward and reached up to grasp the hem of the dryad's tattered gown. The garment clung to his fingers like mist, but he was able to pull her away from the mast and turn her toward him. Her transparent eyes stared into his, and he felt her pain strike him like a blow. She had not withdrawn her magic. She had come to the end of it. Her love had held the great dead tree aloft through storm and gale, but it had at last run out. As her tree had died, as the ship was dying, so the dryad, too, was coming to the end of her life. In that instant, feeling her passion and her gallantry and the unending faithful love she had borne for her tree, Thad's frozen heart melted and then flushed warm with sympathy. Maria had made a fool of him, but here was a female who remained faithful to her true love, even after death. Thad longed to honor her devotion. He leaned forward and, pulling the dryad's spectral form close, he kissed her with all his heart and soul. She returned the kiss, and Thad felt her grow solid under his arms, felt their souls mingle and entwine. And then he felt the life of his body tapped as great tree roots can tap the body of a decaying animal. The dryad in his arms grew strong, and he grew weak. Youth returned to her, and age clattered Thad's bones. Her spirit bloomed as his withered. He had only time to look up into the pine twigs sprouting on the broken mast before his eyes grew dim and closed forever. The sailors around him never understood what had happened or why their young companion fell to the deck, suddenly an emaciated old man. They crossed themselves and thanked their lucky stars and as many gods or saints as seemed prudent, and set about getting their damaged craft through the last of the storm. And when the Jane Dowling limped into port 4 days later, no one had yet thought of a tale to explain the 40-foot white pine, rigged for sail, growing from the deck where the mainmast had once stood.